I'm going to begin, since this is Melbourne and since it was partly Barry's doing that this came about, with a story of an event that happened in the first few weeks that I started my very first job as a philosopher at Monash. I think that we were in Norton's somehow. I seem to think that this was where the philosophers were hanging out. And Barry introduced me to somebody who some of you might know by his pen name. I believe he died a few years ago. His pen name was Whacker on the Wing. This was the name of, his other name is Frank Strawn, I believe. And Barry introduced us, and Whacker said, you have to come to a footy game, and we knew that really he wanted us to come along so that he could make fun of whatever we said in his column. So he took us along to a game in 1990, St Kilda were playing Carlton. And I can't remember very much about the game. I know we were roped in as, neophyte St Kilda supporters since we were living in Elwood. But what I mostly remember, by the way, St Kilda were completely slaughtered. I do remember that part. What I mostly remember is an interesting little exchange that wasn't on the field at all. Down below us were some sainty types, some St Kilda supporters, who were very involved in the game and very annoyed with one of their own team's players. And one of them leant over and bellowed at the top of his lungs, "Get on with it, Laurie, you great girl!" And Frank Strawn, Whacker, next to me, maybe on his best behavior since I was there or something, or maybe he would have said this anyway, without hesitation, yelled straight back down, "What's wrong with a girl?" The sainty supporter whirled straight round and said, "It's got no balls, that's what's wrong with it." So this was my introduction to life in Melbourne. This was my introduction to Aussie rules football. And it was also an introduction to what can go wrong when you try and answer some speech with some counter speech. It's also an interesting example of how the word girl can get used as a slur. The word girl can get used as an insult. What's curious is that the word man can get used as an insult too when it's applied to women. So there's a very nice paper that's coming out soon by Sarah Jane Leslie, who's a philosopher and linguist at Princeton, and her title is Hillary Clinton is the only man in the Obama administration. This was something that she heard, and something like it, I think, was said by a journalist. And she takes this idea, which on the face of it is complimenting Hillary Clinton and making all the rest of the Obama administration out to be bad because they are not men. They haven't got whatever it takes to be a man. They haven't got the balls, as the sainty supporter might have said. But it's also insulting to Hillary Clinton. It's a kind of catch-22. She can succeed in the Obama administration by being a man, but then she is a man, and that is to fail on the other level of evaluation, which is that she ought to be succeeding as a woman as well. So it is quite curious when you think about it that being labeled a girl can be an insult, being labeled a man can be an insult, but there isn't a kind of, it's not exactly an equal opportunity business. When a man is called a woman or a girl, that insults the man. When the woman is called the man, that can sort of compliment the woman, but it is also an insult because she's failing as a woman. But it also insults the men in the Obama administration for failing to be proper men. And you sort of can't have it, you can't sort of have it both ways. Okay, now one thing I want to do in this talk is to explain how some of David Lewis's work on the pragmatics of conversation, some of David Lewis's work on helping us understand how conversations evolve dynamically over time, can help us understand how race and gender slurs work. I also want to say, by the way, before I get too far with this, that there is a phenomenon that governs all discussions of slurs, epithets, shocking, offensive language. No matter how hard you try, some of the offensiveness sort of leaks out. This is the phenomenon I'm going to call leaky quotes. And I hope that, you know, when we go like this, when we speak, that somehow insulates what we say. And I hope that when we write and put quotation marks around it, that somehow insulates what we say. But philosophers are being far too idealistic if they think that quotation marks are enough to insulate. It doesn't help when your child comes home from school saying, you know, little Betty said boom, and then whatever the boom is, it had quotation marks around it, but still the parent is going to be pretty shocked that she said it even with quotation marks. Okay, there's a practical injunction which goes with this. I'm the manufacturer of this handout. This actually, as my handouts go, is not a particularly offensive one. Nevertheless, please dispose of it carefully, because one thing that we know about slurs and epithets and offensive language generally is that their offense is a highly context-sensitive matter, and the offense can leak through quotations and academic discussion. So I'm not telling you just sort of to burn it when you leave the room, but I would ask you to dispose of it carefully. So I said I was going to be talking about race and gender slurs. Obviously, this is a huge topic. I can't do anything more than, you know, the tip of the iceberg here. And alongside of thinking of race and gender slurs, we ought to be thinking of sort of homophobic slurs as well. I'm going to be focusing mostly on what these phenomena have in common, even though they are going to be importantly different in ways that I'm not going to do justice to. I just want to flag that. I know that I shouldn't be sort of lumping them all together in the ways I'm going to be, but I hope that it can be useful to see some of the things they have in common. I want to bring out, thinking about Lewis, that he saw conversations as being, in certain respects, like that Aussie rules game. He didn't compare it with an Aussie rules football game, he compared it with a baseball game, because despite his deep love of Australia, he picked baseball for his example rather than Aussie rules. And in a famous paper called Scorekeeping in a Language Game, he argued that conversations run in a way that is in certain respects comparable to a sports game. You have a scoreboard. It's not a literal scoreboard up there in lights, but there's a scoreboard which is, you can think of as an abstract structure that tracks all the play that's done. It tracks all the moves that are made, and it tracks the norms governing appropriate play. And he spelt out many different ways in which this score evolved over time. There's another way in which it's not quite like a scoreboard. It's like a scoreboard that tracks everything. It doesn't just track the goals or the points. It also tracks the details about what moves are legitimate at different points. So it's a rather, idealized, complicated scoreboard that keeps track of everything that needs to be taken for granted at each new stage of the conversation. So after spelling out this analogy for a certain time, he said, but here's the interesting thing. There's one major way in which conversational language games are completely unlike a sports game, and that is that when players make a move that assumes that move is a good move to make, it can become a good move to make. This is the phenomenon that he called the phenomenon of accommodation. So, in baseball, if somebody all of a sudden starts treating the batsman as out after having had only 2 strikes, that doesn't make it right that 2 strikes and you're out. It's still 3 strikes and you're out. But in a conversation, there's a kind of plasticity to it, which means that if something is said or done that needs to be correct, the conversation will conform and make that correct. This is the phenomenon of accommodation, that conversational score tends to evolve in whatever way is required to make the play count as correct. And he used a lot of different examples. When you say, I promise, that is a classic performative, as J.L. Austin called it. When you say, I promise, you're not describing some state of affairs independent of what you're saying just now. What you say demands for its truth that I promise be true. In other words, that you are actually promising. And so this performative is a kind of self-fulfilling statement that makes itself true. And this goes for many other performatives as well. Presupposition introduction. If I say, even Hillary could win. Thinking of our earlier example. If I say, even Hillary could win, somebody might respond, what do you mean, even Hillary? But if nobody responds, even Hillary, something gets added to the score of the conversation beyond merely the assertion Hillary could win, which is the official thing that's up for debate. That little word even adds something to the score, which, if it remains unblocked, suggests that Hillary is an unpromising candidate, or there's some reason why you would be surprised that she would win. So the sneaky ways in which things get added to the score, even though they're not at the forefront of what's being done with words, this was one of the things that he was interested in, and there what we have is a case of presupposition introduction, which, if unblocked, gets accommodated by the conversation. I'm going to say a lot more about presupposition introduction in a minute, and that's because I think that slurs might well work via the phenomenon of presupposition introduction. I don't think that exhausts what they do. I think they do a whole lot more than that, but that might be part of how they work. Okay. He talked about performatives, presupposition, permissibility. Here's one of David's examples. The master says to the slave, you are now permitted to cross the white line. As soon as the master says that, the boundary of permissibility shifts straight away so that the slave is permitted to cross the white line where he wasn't before. This, by the way, is in fact another Austinian illocution, or roughly speaking, performative. So norm setting is another case where the conversation, if nothing happens to block what's said, provided certain conditions are fulfilled, the assumption that what you've done is the correct thing to do makes it correct unless assuming that nothing else has gone wrong to interrupt it. So that's the thought. Standard shifting is another major thing that he applied the phenomenon of accommodation to, and that's received a lot of attention in philosophy since then. Suppose somebody says, Italy is boot-shaped, France is hexagonal. And everybody goes along with that. Yeah, Italy's boot-shaped, France is hexagonal. That's enough to help you find it in an atlas. And then some pedant says, oh, Italy's not really boot-shaped. I mean, imagine wearing a boot that looked like Italy. I mean, it hasn't got a nice flat sole or something. Anyway, you can imagine somebody blocking this and saying it's not really boot-shaped. When that happens, the standards are shifting. And Lewis asked the question, was it false first time round that Italy was boot-shaped? He says, no, it was true then that given the standards in play at that stage of the conversation that Italy was boot-shaped. But later the standards shift. It's not that Italy, sorry, so when the standards shift, it no longer is true that Italy is boot-shaped. It was true before. So he has an interest, this is a kind of contextualist story about standards and how they shift over time. And he noted something curious about it, which is that the pedants usually have the upper hand. That is to say, somebody who says, oh, no, that's not boot-shaped, usually wins against someone who says, oh, yeah, it's boot-shaped, because precisification, he thought, had a kind of momentum going with it. And philosophers have made a great deal of use of this idea elsewhere in epistemology, because one of its main applications has been to conversations where somebody says, well, I know what time the bus leaves today, and the respondent says, oh, you don't really know that. What makes you think that? Well, you don't really know that. And what do you mean I don't know it? Here's the timetable. Oh, you don't really know that. There might be a deceitful demon who is putting these ideas in your head, etc., etc. So the skeptical response comes in, and the standards shift for knowledge, just as they shift for boot-shapedness for Italy. And this thought of David Lewis's has actually generated a huge sort of sub-discipline in epistemology of contextualism about knowledge. Now, David Lewis noted that, that there can be this kind of asymmetric pliability of the standard shifting, that it's easier to tighten the standards when it comes to knowledge, and it's easier to tighten the standards when it comes to Italy being boot-shaped than it is to loosen them. Now, I wonder whether this assumption that the asymmetric pliability always goes in favor of raising standards, I wonder whether this assumption comes from a certain a certain salience of philosophical conversation. Because as Mary Kate McGowan has commented in other work, and so has Bob Simpson, by the way, who teaches now at Monash, asymmetric pliability of conversations can actually push in the other direction. That is to say, think now of the case of slurs. When one person starts using slurs, when one person starts using demeaning language, racial epithets and the like, that, in a sense, does shift standards, and the more it's done, the more standards sort of sink to the bottom. So one thing that you might want to say is that there's, and what Mary Kate McGowan has wanted to say is that asymmetric pliability of conversations can actually, it is a very real phenomenon. It doesn't always make the standards higher, it sometimes makes them lower. And once things start shifting in that direction, they can be much harder to raise. Another example is standards about sexual explicitness. It can be much harder to, it can be much easier to push towards more explicitness than to less, and that's something that Mary Kate McGowan comments on in her paper about this. And she calls this the phenomenon of the difficulty of unringing a bell once it's been rung. So just to stop at this point and say, here's what we want to bring out of David Lewis's picture about the dynamic evolution of conversations. There is this phenomenon of accommodation that is extremely widespread, where the score of the game tends to evolve in whatever way is required to make the play count as correct. That's the big asymmetry with the sports case. He talked about how speech acts, presupposition, and so forth illustrate this. He noted the phenomenon of asymmetric pliability of conversations. And, by the way, he commented completely explicitly, and I agree with him 100%, that these illustrations show how language games, how language use blends into other social practices. He makes this comment in connection with thinking about the performative of marriage. When you say, I do, there is a phenomenon of accommodation which brings it about that I do, meaning I do marry, becomes true at the very time that you say it. The language game accommodates to that. And he says, does this mean that marriage is a linguistic phenomenon? No. The whole point is that what we do in language games is seamlessly connected with other social practices, and to say that you perform a marriage with words is not to say that marriage is a linguistic phenomenon. And this is going to be very important when it comes to thinking about slurs. To say that slurs are only words is to assume that what they do is just a linguistic phenomenon. But as David said, doing things with words, and he's picking up on a powerful idea in the work of J.L. Austin and, of course, in many other theorists, including more recently feminist work and critical race theory, that language has force and power which actually can shape the social world. And in a way, this is an analytic philosopher of language talking about a familiar phenomenon from other disciplines of social construction. This is Lewis's take on a certain dimension of that. So slurs can, even though their words are not only words, just as a marriage is not only words for Lewis. So I want now to claim that race and gender slurs exploit accommodation. What I mean is that they can be performatives that assault, subordinate, rank as inferior. So the assaulting variety is very vivid in a much discussed example in Randall Kennedy's book. Hank Aaron, we're still keeping on the sporting theme, a baseball player who was poised in 1973 to break Babe Ruth's record for career home runs. He received a huge amount of hate mail, and most of it was extremely racist. So I've put an example as example 3 under the quotations on the handout. And this is just one example of very many. Dear N. Henry, I'm not going to say it, you are not going to break this record established by the great Babe Ruth if you can help it. Whites are far more superior than jungle bunnies. My gun is watching your every black move. So a number of things are being done with words there, and the claim that the fundamental thing that letter is trying to do is attack a particular player. It's trying to attack Hank Aaron. And so there you have, and this is the idea of words that wound, to take the title of a volume edited by Mari Matsuda and some other critical race theorists, that there can be words, and this is one of an important function of slurs, that they attack, and they're quasi-assaults, they're like verbal assaults. That's not the only way that words can be, that slurs can be used in this way. Slurs can be used in propaganda. They can be used, I have, I think, an example from Der Stürmer, published by Julius Streicher in 1935 and 1943 on 2. The Jew silenced the voice of German blood. That is why the Stürmer keeps hammering away. That is why its voice keeps saying, the Jews are our misfortune. He who eats with the Jew perishes. He who knows the Jew knows the devil. The devilish hatred of the Jews plunged the world into war, need, and misery. Our holy hate will bring us victory and save all of mankind. Those were both, by the way, in essays written by Ernst Hiemer, but Julius Streicher was the publisher. And, you know, some of you might not recall this fact, but Streicher was actually condemned to death at the Nuremberg trials for speech crimes. Basically, he was condemned to death for publishing this material, which was deemed to have poisoned the minds of German people to the extent that they were willing to accept the genocidal force of the Nazis. So, race and gender slurs are performatives. That's something I've written about elsewhere. They are, as Austen called them, illocutionary acts that do things with words beyond simply uttering meaningful sentences. And some of the things they do involve assaulting, propagandizing, subordinating, ranking as inferior, and sometimes they do this through presupposition. So one of the other phenomena that Lewis paid attention to, presupposition introduction, is very relevant when it comes to slurs. Some philosophers have argued that slurs, whether they're as potent as the N-word, or whether philosophers like discussing the slur Bosch because it's lost most of its force, apparently. But so using Bosch for the Germans presupposes that Germans are contemptible, but apart from that, they think it just means German. So they presuppose contemptibility, maybe. They enact norms. Think of Lewis's example of the master saying to the slave, "You're now permitted to cross the white line." Slurs can enact norms that make discrimination more permissible. So enactment of norms is another kind of performative, or it's another kind of illocution, to be more precise. And slurs can be tools that alter the score so that now it's more permissible to be awful to the person who's slurred. So they can also shift salience. That I'm not going to spend too much time on the salience issue, but they can rank in part by making certain features hypersalient. So when it comes to sexual objectification, for instance, part of the business of the performative of ranking women as inferior involves making certain sexual features hypersalient. And that's when you think about the list of slurs, which I should really utter so that we're reminded of what they all are, but there's actually been no shortage of them in debate about Julia Gillard. Slurs rank as inferior in part by making a whole lot of sexual features hypersalient. So they shift standards of discourse about the target group. That's the shifting idea, and they might be doing it in a way that is asymmetrically pliable, making things worse rather than better. Now, all of these moves in a language game, and Lewis was extremely alert to this, are very sensitive to background facts. They're just as in a sports game, the move that you can make, or the thing that you can do, depends on your role, whether you're the goalie or whatever your other role might be. What you do is affected and constrained by your role in it. Likewise, in a language game, what you can do with your words is affected by your role in that. And so how slurs work can be sensitive to the authority of the person who is slurring. It can be sensitive to their credibility, and it can be sensitive in general to their social standing. I want to talk about why slurs can be hard to answer. One thing that I've argued elsewhere is that in general, subordinating speech can be hard to answer because it can create what I've called illocutionary disablement. What's that? That's the idea that you say the very right word for the speech act that you're trying to perform, and it isn't the speech act you're trying to perform, even though you're intending it the right way, and even though you've used the right word. Here's an example. Suppose, this is an example from the philosopher Donald Davidson, suppose an actor is on a stage, and his role in the stage is to be a character who has to say there's a fire. I have to be careful with the example, especially in a crowded room, right? And the actor's role is to say, watch the fire, I mean it, look at the smoke. I'm not going to say it too vividly because who knows who is going to come running through the door if I say it too loudly and vividly. And then, says Davidson, a real fire breaks out, and the actor says, fire, I mean it, look at the smoke. He's saying exactly the right thing he should be saying for a warning. He's intending to warn, and what the audience just thinks it's part of the same play, right? So what's going wrong there? That is a case where you're using the right word with the right intention, and it's still not counting as the speech act. In that case, because the conventions surrounding theatre mean that you're not being sincere. It's fiction. It's not real when the actor's doing it. And what I wanted to say is that some other speech acts can have exactly that quality. That is to say, sometimes when you try and do things with your words, it doesn't do the thing that you're trying to do, and the failure is not a failure of achieving certain effects. The failure is right there in the speech act that you're trying to perform itself. The example that I discussed is one that's been discussed by many feminists. Sometimes, suppose a woman says no, meaning to refuse sex, and suppose that no isn't simply, ignored, and sometimes it will be ignored and overridden, and that will be a case of rape where somebody completely knows what they're doing. Or sometimes it'll be listened to and the person will not persist. But sometimes there might be a phenomenon where the no doesn't count as a refusal. That is to say, the right word is being used, no, which is the right word for a refusal, and she's intending to refuse, but it's not counting as the move of refusal. There's more that you need to say about why that could be, but she's not managing to add to the score of that particular conversation the move that changes what's permissible, or that affects what's permissible, to get back to Lewis's example. She's not doing that move with her words, and there's a good question about why not. So so slurs can sometimes be hard to answer, because what you can do with your words depends on who you are and how much credibility you have, in part. So if there is a widespread pattern of slurring particular groups so that they are not seen to be intending what the words that they say, or so that they are not seen to have enough authority over their own words, then it's hard to answer the slur because you haven't got what it takes to answer. You're not listened to. You're like the actor in Davidson's story. That's one way in which there can be a handicap to answering. To the extent that you think that slurs operate as a certain kind of performative, then in general they can't be undone by mere contradiction. That is to say, I mean, if I sort of assert, oh, it's 6:45, you can just contradict me by saying, well, actually, it's raising the standards. It's actually 14 minutes only to to 7. So with an assertion, you can just answer back. But suppose I'm the master and I say, slave, you are not permitted to cross the white line. The slave can't say, oh, yes, I am. Just contradiction is not going to fix it, because the accommodation has happened in virtue of the master's authority over the normative facts that bind the slave. So in general, to the extent that you are willing to agree that slurs have this performative side to them, or this illocutionary side to them that involves the enactment of norms, they can't simply be answered by contradiction any more than the slave can answer the master by saying, oh yes, I can cross the white line. So that's a different dimension. I want to talk in a moment about the handicaps imposed by the handicaps imposed by presupposition introduction. I'm just going to flag that. I'll get to it in a moment. There is also the phenomenon of leaky quotes that I mentioned at the outset when asking you to please dispose of the handout carefully. The phenomenon of leaky quotes can mean that slurs are hard to answer. To think about this, just think about what happens when witnesses have to testify in court about sexual harassment cases, say, and they have to repeat verbatim the words that were said as part of trying to get some redress against the words that were said. So Anita Hill, for instance, when she testified about the sexual harassment that she had encountered, the mere uttering of the words that had been said by her harasser was enough to cause titters and undermine her credibility. And so the phrase that comes to mind from the journalism that I read at that time was, a journalist said, Hill, she comes over as a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty. Anyway, so having uttered those words sort of made it hard to fight those words, because saying the words was enough to backfire on her own credibility, so she sounded nutty and slutty. Those were in quotes, by the way. Anyway, so this is especially so for highly sexual or highly offensive slurs. And I'm not going to get into this here. An important feature of slurs, if you are willing to accept some of the other things that I've said about them, is that they contribute to certain kinds of epistemic injustice. And I take that phrase from work by Miranda Fricker, a philosopher who's now at Sheffield, who wrote a book of that title. Fricker identified two kinds of epistemic injustice. One of the brilliant things about this book is that it is bringing epistemology to the table of politics in a very vivid way. Issues of justice apply not only to resource distribution and so forth, they apply to things like distribution of credibility. If you have less credibility than you deserve, that is an injustice in the same way as if you have less money than you deserve. That's part of what she's after convincing us about. And that kind that I just mentioned, not having the credibility you deserve, is what she calls testimonial injustice. Another kind would be hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical injustice is where you can't identify an important feature of your own experience because of a certain sort of identity prejudicial gap in the conceptual scheme that we're working with. She uses the concept of sexual harassment as an example. Before that concept was brought into being, women who encountered sexual harassment, when they left their jobs, would write at the bottom of the sheet, why did you leave your job? Reason, personal. And of course, one of the things that feminism wants to do is to show how the personal is political. And the concept of sexual harassment enabled women in that situation to understand their own experience differently. And before that concept was there, there's a sense in which they couldn't understand their own experience adequately. So hermeneutical injustice is the idea of there being a kind of gap in the conceptual scheme. And one thing that I've argued about with Miranda Fricker is that it's not just a matter of gaps in the conceptual scheme, it's also a matter of sort of distorting presences in the conceptual scheme too. And here's where I would want to say that slurs, which make salient all sorts of irrelevant features, the slurs which make members of certain races seem animal-like, make women seem sort of hypersexual beings. Slurs which exaggerate these features contribute to a kind of hermeneutical injustice by distorting the resources that we have available to understand the phenomenon, and that in turn makes them hard to answer. So I'm talking about all sorts of snowballing effects that slurs have that make them hard to answer. How many minutes have I got? 10. Okay, thank you. So I want to talk now a little bit about presupposition itself. And what I'm going to be talking about applies to presupposition introduction generally, and it applies to slurs if you think that they work by presupposition introduction or something like that. I think that getting stuff in through presupposition, like even Hillary could win, is a really sneaky way to get stuff into a conversation. The official move you're making is Hillary could win. And you're sneakily, with that little word even, getting some other stuff into the score as well. So I want to think about what makes them sneaky. Of course, as I said, and as Lewis commented, you can block the sneaky move by saying, what do you mean, even, Hillary? But there are handicaps to that blocking move. So I want to talk about those handicaps. Some of the handicaps are epistemological. They affect how we notice or know what's going on with the move. The presupposition gets in the back door, it gets in under the radar, the attention is deflected. Also, this is another epistemological matter, it's presented as if we take that for granted. It's common knowledge. So if I say even Hillary could win, I'm taking for granted that we all think that she's an unpromising candidate. It's presented as what everybody already knows. I reckon, this is a hypothesis, that speakers are less accountable for what they're getting in through their presuppositions. That is to say, if you're going to hold the speaker accountable for a sentence like even Hillary could win, the prime focus of what she's accountable for is the proposition Hillary could win. She could easily backtrack on, forget the even. My main thing I was saying is she could win. So the accountability, she's not putting herself as especially accountable for the backdoor stuff. That's my thought. So those are the epistemological ones. The structural ones, they can't just be blocked by simple negation. Philosophers, for some reason, have had, as a paradigm example of presupposition introduction for many years, the sentence, have you stopped beating your wife? It's very curious when you look through the diet of philosophical examples and you find what they are saying implicitly about gender. But anyway, so, and philosophers have noticed that you can't just say no in response to that question. And you can't say yes, you can't say no, you've got to do something more complicated in answer to the question, have you stopped beating your wife? So they're not answerable by simple negation. That doesn't mean they're not answerable, it means it's a bit more complicated to answer them. There are normative reasons that present handicaps. Blocking can derail conversation. It can violate norms of cooperation. If someone's putting something forward as being their focus and you look at some little side issue, it looks like you're being trivial. It looks like you're being uncooperative. If you say, oh, what do you mean even? I think Hillary's great. You're saying, look, I was talking about she could win. If you focus on the even, you're being a complete pain. Whereas, and the same thing could be happening if you try and block the presupposition component of a slur. What did you mean she's? anyway, now that this is being recorded, you know, I'm actually feeling slightly nervous about uttering all of these slurs. This is part of the, so this is probably the most the least foul-mouthed talk about slurs you'll ever hear. Anyway, okay. There are also asymmetric social norms about politeness, cooperation, which exacerbate all of the above. And I've already mentioned that if it's an enactment, then if it's a norm enactment, then it can't be answered in the same way that the master, who says you're now permitted to cross the white line, he can't be answered by a slave unless the slave all of a sudden, boom, gets equal authority. So the authority sensitivity of norm enactment is another reason why there can be a handicap here. So I know I'm running short of time. Let me say that if you regard slurs as part of a much wider pattern of oppressive speech, and if your understanding of oppressive speech has the idea that we have here speech acts that can be self-fulfilling, not just in the little local way that I promise makes itself true. That was on Lewis's view of promising, that I promise makes itself true. There's a kind of self-fulfillingness that is broader in scope, where a subordinating or an oppressive speech act makes itself true by making a whole class of people conform to it. What I have in, so a paradigm example would be a legal enactment that said blacks are not permitted to vote. That's not a slur, but it's a piece of legislation, let's suppose. That, just like I promise, makes itself true. And when it makes itself true, that is not merely a linguistic matter, that's a matter that brings into being a class of subordinate people. That is to say, it brings into being their subordination. Straight away, it follows Lewis's rules of accommodation. The same thing can happen in micro levels with slurs in everyday conversation. This takes a lot more argument than I'm giving now, and a number of people have made the case far better than I'm going to be able to do in the remaining time. But the thought is that just as blacks are not permitted to vote is a speech act which meets with accommodation. You can't just block that by saying, oh, yes, they are. If you're just a citizen, you can't block that. So patterns of slurs can be self-fulfilling in the same way and bring it about that the people, the groups of people that they refer to, have a subordinate status, have the kind of subordinate status that the slur is saying that they have. That depends, of course, on how authoritative and also perhaps how pervasive they are. But there's more to say about authority, which is that authority itself follows rules of accommodation. I'm just trying to think, what do I most want to say in the remaining time? I want to say something about bystander responsibility, and part of the reason I want to say this is that it's been drawn to my attention that right here in Melbourne there is an anti-hate speech campaign. It might be further afield for all I know, and I was shown a wonderful poster which has a spray can spraying out anti-hate, apply anti-hate, and it's a government-sponsored anti-hate speech campaign. And it's asking bystanders to take responsibility for any hate speech that they hear, I think especially on public transport maybe. So what's the point there? What Lewis says about the way conversations evolve is something that absolutely vindicates that perspective. You can't, if you don't, sorry, remember what we said about even Hillary could win. If somebody doesn't jump in and say, what do you mean even Hillary? The assumption that she's an unpromising candidate just gets automatically added to the score and it gets taken on board by all the participants. Now, a conversation on public transport is a little bit different because it's not quite clear who the conversationalists are. It's not quite clear when you see some racist abusing his or her target. It's not quite clear whether you as a bystander are part of the conversation, whether you're in a position to say, what do you mean even? Or what do you mean, and then whatever the slur is. Well, we don't, yeah, it stops here as the campaign I saw goes. So there's that kind of ambiguity about who are the members of this conversational game is what makes us very reluctant to jump in. But nevertheless, if nobody jumps in, there's a kind of derived authority from the omissions of all of the speakers around. That is what Lewis's understanding of how things get added to the score and how they are potentially blocked can make us see. If nobody blocks it, if nobody blocks what that move is doing, it will get added to the score, at least in that context. It doesn't mean that everybody will believe it, but there will be all sorts of normative implications which wouldn't be there. So I actually think that Lewis's picture and others has got some quite radical implications for what we need to do, what our duties are to do when as contributors to the speech situation of which we are all taking part. And so there are morals here about bystander responsibility that are really, really tough. And they will prevent the accommodation of the slur, and they also, by the way, will prevent the accommodation of authority, because there's a sense in which the omissions of the others contribute to the authority of the speaker. This is something that Ishani Maitra has written about in a paper that I put some of the references at the handout at the end if you want to chase any of them up. I'm not as a political philosopher, going to spell out what the implications of this way of thinking are for free speech and for free speech principles, but I will conclude with just a couple of remarks. Sometimes when discussing why we should have free speech, the thought is you can always fight bad words with more words. So this is vivid in the words of Brandeis in the Whitney case in 1927, to courageous, self-reliant men with confidence in the power of free and fearless reasoning applied through the processes of popular government, no danger flowing from speech can be deemed clear and present unless the incidence of the evil apprehended is so imminent that it may befall before there is opportunity for full discussion. If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. In other words, the remedy for bad speech is more speech. I would love to think that is true, but notice Brandeis's assumptions. Brandeis assumed that speech is something, discussion. He assumed that speech has certain defects. It can be false. He assumed that there's some remedies for those, more discussion. He assumed that the conditions for those remedies are what? Some education. And he thought that they hold. I think the answer to Brandeis's assumptions there are no, no, no on all counts. That is to say, he has a mistaken view about what speech is. It's not just discussion. Speech enacts norms. Lewis's stories show us how all sorts of speech are doing things, performing things, changing norms, making certain things salient and other things less salient. They are doing things which is not just about reasoned discussion in the way that Brandeis says. I would want to say no to all of his others as well, but I won't get carried away. Now, David Lewis, and I want to be fair to him here because I've been using some of his work to support feminist work that I think he, in principle, would be very sympathetic to, but would be concerned about possible political implications. And I know he would be because just recently in the process of packing up my stuff to put in the 40-foot container to ship to Cambridge, UK, I found a letter from him, which was about some early work that I was doing on this topic together with Carolyn West, who teaches philosophy at the University of Sydney. He said that he liked our paper and he agreed with our point. In other words, he agreed with this application, this particular application of the work he was doing in scorekeeping, so that made me feel good. But then he said, I would be concerned because it looks as though it applies not only to the case we were thinking about, namely pornography, in that particular paper, but many other cases as well. So he was absolutely right. The things that we were talking about apply much further afield. And he said he wanted me to consider the idea that free speech is actually a kind of tacit bargain, and that if we start threatening that tacit bargain, we might demolish it, and the forces of darkness had a lot more to win from that demolition than we do. And I believe, was a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. He's a staunch defender of free speech, and for excellent reasons. What he was saying, just briefly in that letter, is also something that he developed more fully in a paper called Mill and Milk Toast, that some of you might know, where he said that Mill's views defending free speech didn't get us nearly far enough, and the best way of understanding free speech is as a kind of a tacit bargain, as a kind of resolution of a coordination problem, as a kind of answer to a certain kind of prisoner's dilemma, for those of you who are familiar with that. I completely sympathize with what David Lewis was saying there, but what I want to suggest, and I'll just leave with this thought, what I want to suggest is that Lewis's own work on how language games follow rules of accommodation and how the moves that are made are sensitive to situation and to authority, and how they can be harder to block because of the many reasons that he makes clear, even though he was not talking about slurs and even though he was not talking about hate speech or politically sensitive speech. What I want to suggest is that his picture actually gives us resources for thinking that the speech situation is by no means a level playing field, and it's only against the background of a level playing field that the assumption that it's just this bargain, this tacit bargain where unless we get it right, we're all going to be worse off. There's an assumption of symmetry there which simply doesn't hold, and his work on the philosophy of language explains why it doesn't hold. So I wish he was here so that I could talk with him about this more. Like many philosophers, we miss David Lewis immensely, and as a person and as a philosopher, and I would love to have him here so that I could talk with him about it more. But in the meantime, that's one conversation, that's one particular language game that I'm not going to be able to pursue, and instead I'll just stop now and maybe have one with you. Thank you. When you're asking who is part of the conversation, if you have a situation where the targets of the speech are not present, then there isn't even the opportunity to answer the speech. There isn't even the opportunity. So that is a certain kind of structural handicap, which doesn't arise from the sort of linguistic situation, but from the shape of the shape of the social group where that kind of where those kinds of exchanges happen. So I just want to mention two things that you said were excellent. One is when people are kept out, when the targets are kept out, they can't answer. That's absolutely so. And that belongs, by the way, with a whole lot of stuff that I should have mentioned, which is that in general, when we're looking at barriers to answering bad speech with more speech, there are very many concrete material barriers that are in many ways more important than the somewhat subtle things I've been talking about here. You know, you can't answer if you can't read and write. You know, illiteracy is a tremendous material barrier. Poverty is a tremendous barrier. If you're so desperately trying to get enough to get food on the table, you're not going to have the luxury to spend time, you know, debating finer points anyway. So there are many, many concrete material circumstances, and the shape of the conversational group is a hugely important one. I completely agree about that. The other thing I wanted to mention that I thought was great in what you said was that you have in that example, arguably, and now thinking in the terms that Miranda Fricker encourages us to think, you have a certain sort of conceptual scheme being set up without, as you mentioned, the contribution from one of their main targets, which makes certain things visible and certain things not visible, and which distorts what it does make visible. So it's a case of what Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice. That is to say, the shape of the concepts is depriving them of knowledge, but depriving them of knowledge in a way that other people are going to suffer the consequences. Thanks. Well, I think that the issue of the press is okay. Freedom of the press and freedom of speech are not exactly the same thing. This is something that Nora O'Neill has been writing about recently, and I think I agree with her. The press has, the press is a tremendous contributor to issues that matter when you're thinking about the point of free speech. I mean, whether that point is thought of as knowledge or the ability to, you know, speak truth to power, as we say. But it isn't the same thing as self-expression. So, you know, a media magnate doesn't have the same sort of right of individual self-expression. It's not an exercise of individual self-expression when a big media magnate you know, decides to campaign against a particular politician, say, in your example. I'm not sure whether you're wanting me to say, you know, how does Lewis's way of thinking about language help us get a grip on that? One thing that it does is make us think about the speech acts that are done by the media as contributions to a kind of national level language game, whose purposes are somewhat, it's not clear what they are. I mean, certainly one important role of the press is, you know, as a contribution to the workings of democracy but the power and authority are not quite the same, but the power and the authority of the media mean that the speech acts that are being performed are going to be quite different to the speech acts that you or I perform, just because, in the same way that it's not exactly the same way, but in a similar way to the way that a legislator, when the legislator says blacks are not permitted to vote, is doing something different to what a citizen in apartheid South Africa would be saying if they said blacks are not permitted to vote. Obviously, there's a big difference when a major authoritative speaker with a huge amount of power does it. Now, I'm not saying that the media are like the law. Obviously, they don't have that sort of authority, but they can but nevertheless, the kind of authority they do have enables their speech acts to be something other than it would otherwise be. And I do think that that does help shape the normative structure that we live in, and it does make certain things very hard to answer, especially for individuals. Yeah, thanks. I am a big fan of J.L. Austin's work, as many people know. And I think that he was mistaken in thinking it extended so narrowly. So, for instance, he said he was only going to attend to serious speech, whereas we all know that jokes can do all sorts of really interesting things with words, including some of the very things that we're talking about here. You know, racist jokes and sexist jokes can help alter norms and salience facts and all of the things that we're talking about here. So, you know, I think I think that what Lewis is doing in the scorekeeping paper is a comparatively recent development in pragmatics of ideas in Austin that help us see how Austinian performatives don't have to be understood just as highly ceremonial speech acts, but are there in all sorts of everyday conversations. That everyday conversations can be doing just the norm-altering things with words that Austin thought only rather highly ceremonial ones did, like the speech of the legislator. And so I think his work has way more scope than he noticed. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Thanks. So when I was talking about an over-rosy view of the level playing field, that was especially apropos of the argument about a tacit bargain that Lewis mentioned. With respect to Brandeis, my objection, I mean, he might be assuming a level playing field, but I wasn't arguing that. I was arguing that he had a mistaken view about what speech is, or at least an oversimplistic view about what speech is, and an over-rosy view about the conditions under which bad speech can be answered. So I think that maybe he would accept some. I hope that he would accept some of what I'm saying here. So this isn't primarily a paper about, you know, what are the limits of free speech. It's not primarily a paper about, you know, should slurs be banned. It's not this kind of paper. It's trying to understand how they work in light of what Lewis's philosophy helps us see. Nevertheless, I do think that it has implications for certain over-optimistic pictures that you sometimes find by people like Brandeis and other philosophers of law about how speech works. So, at the very least, what's being done is a certain kind of argument for a somewhat narrow view of free speech is being questioned. That doesn't mean to say that there might not be all sorts of other arguments that were much better than Brandeis's for why we should have exactly the kinds of law that he wanted. So, you know, philosophically, there's a gap between anything that I'm doing here and a particular piece of policy or legislation. Nevertheless, I think that it is likely that speech that comes under the heading of hate speech, speech that comes under the heading of certain sorts of pornography, which might in fact count as hate speech themselves, are likely not protected by most free speech principles, and that's partly because free speech principles are not about protecting speech that is doing stuff like altering norms. You know, a master saying you're now permitted to cross the white line or you're now not allowed to cross the white line, that kind of norm-altering speech, and this is a point that Mary Kate McGowan and Ishani Maitra have made, that kind of norm-altering speech is not what free speech is about. Free speech, you know, is in part about the sorts of things that Mill said. It's about the pursuit of knowledge, it's about communication, it's about the conditions under which we can flourish together in a democracy. And so speech that isn't having the functions that help that, I don't see that those that those rationales would protect them. But that's not what this paper was about. That would be a much bigger argument elsewhere. Thank you. So I'm not sure whether I would count, I'm not sure whether I would count the very damaging omissions that occur when, you omit a whole group of people in your history of a subject. I'm not sure I would count that as a slur, but I haven't got, I haven't offered you a definition of a slur or a worked out theory of what slurs are or anything like that. I mean, I would think that it's extremely oppressive and helps contribute to exactly the same phenomena that we've been describing here. But I'm not sure I would use the word slur to describe it. But I do think that some things I would call slurs definitely work by a kind of omission. And I mean, you might think that by omitting certain relevant features of the group of people. So, in the slurs for Hank Aaron, when he's being name called, Jungle Bunny, and all the rest of it, the slur is part of the point of the slur, not just to say you're an animal, but to leave out. It's you're just an animal. There's nothing more of interest to you than that. You're not the great sporting hero that other people think, or whatever. So this part of the slur is designed to focus attention, or to use a demeaning metaphor, but in that case, to sometimes just to focus attention. So, I mean, I've actually wondered whether some supposed compliments. Well, obviously, Hillary Clinton's the only man is a supposed compliment. Some supposed compliments might be slurs in contexts where, okay, this would be a bit like the Rudd and Gillard case, where the famous example in pragmatics is a letter of reference about a student which compliments their handwriting at great length, says she has the most wonderful handwriting I've ever seen, and this is a letter of reference for her as a philosopher. This is I wouldn't say it's a slur, but there might be a slur that did exactly that job. By focusing attention on a property that shouldn't in this context be relevant. So so the wolf whistle when a senior politician enters the room, you might think of as a kind of slur because it's because it's focusing attention on something that shouldn't be relevant in that context. And it's a slur sort of by omission. It's omitting the stuff that should be relevant. So that's one way in which some slurs, I mean, even, she's hot or whatever in a context where that's not the sort of thing to be saying, is a kind of, I don't know, I could be persuaded that that was a slur in certain contexts. It's a very context-sensitive matter, yeah, even though it's designed to be a compliment. That is another whole area where gender slurs in particular are hard to answer because their speakers will say, "What do you mean? I was being nice. This is a compliment. What do you wish I said? That you're a dog, Anyway. Yeah.